I'm constantly presented with interesting situations where we have to be nimble and dynamic and sensitive to the family and representing them. You're an ambassador. Answer that question with a question, which is how do you define a family office first of all, and then we can go from there about who's faking.
One of the hardest things to do.
I did a year of super yacht operations at the University of Portsmouth, which sounds like something that doesn't exist but does extraordinarily. I think with the growth of the family and the growth of the family office, it becomes a more sort of corporate aligned structure.
Welcome to the second episode of the AYU Family Office Podcast. We've had a great day recording today. Actually done 2 episodes today, so this is our second one. We're coming out just as we are going to Miami. You'll be boarding a plane. As people are listening to this, you can listen to yourself as you fly over the Atlantic.
Packing some nice sunglasses and dresses, getting away from, as you can see, cold, dark London.
Do you think we're going to have the guest list set by the time you go on that plane, or people are going to be asking questions?
Oh, people will be asking questions.
They always are, right up until the last
questions.
minute. If you're not on the list by now, it might be too late.
People will be asking me questions and emailing me questions whilst I'm at the event, I'm sure.
Yeah, especially about the boat. I think there's going to be a queue at that boat this year, so just beware. Members only. And if there's guests coming, I think they probably need to have booked by now.
Yes, please do, because we want to make sure that you can all get involved and enjoy us during that time.
We're there every year. We will be back. We're going to be in Miami every month this year with members events and some really exciting stuff. We should probably jump in and introduce today's guest.
Yes.
Felicia Andjel, who is at Mittal Family Office, one of our long-term members again. Fantastic, interesting, incredibly erudite and very, very specific skill set this individual has got. And she tells us all about it, isn't she? It's really interesting.
I think it's interesting because, especially within this space, we deal with a lot of the investment side of things. You know, we're dealing with family offices from the asset allocation side, whereas hearing from the operation side, especially...
I had a lot of exposure to that, really, the
No.
non-investment asset type thing. And obviously that's a massive part of our family office world, so
it is.
I think that's going to chime with a lot of people.
Well, yeah, I mean, talking about marine, aviation, real estate, it's...
Getting a yacht through the Suez Canal when the Houthis are... Yeah, she really uncovers some really interesting stuff, and the specifics of her expertise. There's only a few people in the world who do the things that she does.
Well, I remember her mentioning she's only ever met one other person that does what she does.
Crazy skill set, yeah. It's really specific.
I really like knowing about the pleasure purchases as well. Pleasure buying, pleasure... Does that sound weird?
Probably, yeah. You need to extend it to lifestyle and
buying
art
for lifestyle and pleasure.
Otherwise, it does sound a bit off topic.
Let's make
not
sure.
wander into those waters.
Yes. No.
Yes. It's
Pardon the pun.
Fantastic conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Good afternoon, Felicia. How are you? Welcome to 2025 Mayfair AYU Studios. Good to see you.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and what a good start to 2025.
Yeah, sun's shining in London in January. That never happens.
Yeah, well, we've got snow where I am, which is even more exciting.
Yeah, whereabouts?
We're West Sussex.
Oh, nice.
So,
okay.
yeah, very nice. And actually, I caught a couple of AYU members on a run the other day next to our house with their caps on.
God, I love that.
We need to get more pictures.
Yeah, spread.
Yeah, we have a hashtag cap intro, which is rolling.
Great.
I'm not sure how we can push that, but well, yes, thank you for joining us. Can you maybe just give us a quick intro on you, where you work, family office background?
So it's operations management for the Mittal Family Office, Lakshmi Mittal and his family.
And can you just give us obviously a very famous name, but can you give us a bit of a background on the family and the business and the, I guess, kind of source of wealth for the wider market?
Yeah, of course. So I think that most people know that their source of wealth is steel and steel mining. The family have a really interesting route to amassing wealth, and I don't want to sort of mistell the story, but as a start in Indonesia, I think Mr. Mittal's father had mining set up there, and Mr. Mittal then subsequently took on part of that commercial mining operation, and his brother had also taken on the other part of the steel mining. And I believe that Lakshmi's steel mining operations was specific to Indonesia, and he was very successful with the mine and expanded the operation throughout Asia and other regions such as Kazakhstan. And then, of course, the company diversified into other commercial interests thereafter, but predominantly the business remains steel. Quite a lot of people, when you say I'm working for a family office, immediately say, well, how did you get into that? And quite often I find with myself and other people that answer this question, it's quite a convoluted route. It's not sort of an obvious corporate climb.
It's an organic space.
That's it, yeah. And it's often that the family office have a need that they didn't necessarily think that they would have, and then there's a sort of organic kind of growth process to the family office. Often they'll, as you know, bring on an investment professional, but then they realize the family have other needs. And so I guess to start at the beginning for me was 2010, working in real estate in East London, working on some really interesting opportunities at a time when only the Hoxton really existed in terms of luxury in that space. And now, of course, it's unrecognizable for restaurants and luxury options. And I met a guy who worked for a family office, and they were working on a really interesting development project, grade 1 listed, in Mayfair. And we got talking about his job and the team, and it was an enormous project, working with English Heritage and Westminster County Council and all sorts of interesting architectural partners. And he said, well, what about coming on board to the team, the family office team, and joining us on the project and doing something a bit different? And I said, well, this sounds super interesting. How many opportunities do you get to work on? And at the time, this was a 75,000 square foot renovation project in Zone 1 London near Buckingham Palace. So I came on board to work on that project. It was 6 years from start to completion, although I joined sort of partway through that process. And as I got to know the family, and I'm sure many of your other guests will have said the same thing, it's a trust building exercise, isn't it? You start off doing one thing with one remit, and then they say, well, could you look after this in addition for us? And so the role sort of organically grew into a head of operations role, whereby it wasn't just the real estate development for the family. It became working across their sort of personal passion assets. So about a year after I joined, we were looking after the finance process for a super yacht construction in Italy. And as I got a few months into this construction process, I realized that the rigorous protocols that we were putting the real estate development project through just didn't apply to this super yacht construction project. So I started doing a bit of research and due diligence about how do people build super yachts. And at the time, it was sort of relatively nascent kind of industry. People weren't building to great scale, and if they were, there was sort of, a handful of them, and everyone could name them, particularly led by Brownfitch and his portfolio of yachts. And so I guess that started the kind of yachting component, where the family said, well, if you don't know about this, then go away and learn. And so I did, and I did a year of super yacht operations at the University of Portsmouth, which sounds like something that doesn't exist, but does, extraordinarily. And that took me across things like Admiralty law, right the way through to construction, regulation, flagging, classification, and got really interested in the marine component of super yacht construction. And then was sort of writing my dissertations and things whilst I was doing the job for the family. And then came in the third component of aircraft management, because it seemed a sort of relatively natural fit, real estate, aviation, marine. But I didn't know of anyone else in the world that was doing a similar sort of job. And so after about 6 years, I made a few phone calls and started networking a bit more and to see if anyone else was doing this role. And I found, I'd say, 1 or 2 other people that were doing sort of variations of this very niche kind of operations role. And then just to sort of finish up to present day, I worked for the family for 6 years or so. And we completed the yacht project, which was superb, Italian, very beautiful build, not without its problems with Italian construction, but a super opportunity for me. We completed the real estate development grade 1 listed, which is phenomenal, and sort of sits, I think, as a kind of pièce de résistance within the English heritage portfolio. And then with the aircraft management side of things, we acquired 1 new aircraft in the time we were there. We sold 2 aircraft, and then ongoing day-to-day management. And then after 6 years, another opportunity crossed my desk where another family were moving their life to London. And they said, this was a Russian family, and they said, look, we're looking for someone with grade 1 listed renovation experience, someone that knows about super yachts, and someone that can manage our aircraft. And it just so serendipitously happened. There was one person that happened to have done all of those 2 things. And so then I joined the Russian Family Office. And the interest for me there was that I wanted to do ground up. So I'd joined a project where we were 2 years in, or the yacht development and the building construction contract had already been negotiated. I wanted to go right back to the start again and build things from scratch all the way up. And so it gave me a beautiful opportunity to do that. And then I guess from there, just to round everything off, after we built a structure for managing those assets once they were completed construction, I then stepped away actually to have my children for 2 years and thought, well, I'll never get back into this. And then, what do you know? A few years later, I got a phone call saying, we have this very niche role that's become available based in London for quite a well-known family. And they want someone that knows about these 3 areas. And
again, the same 3.
That's it, yeah. And they were looking to do new construction of a much larger super yacht, this time hybrid. So my ears pricked up and I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. It's a new component I hadn't worked on before. They've got a listed property. We're doing some renovation work to that. And I thought, all right, so I'll do it one more time. And so there we are today.
Okay, so that's a really specific skill set you've got. Did you find, are there other people with that same skill set? Do you have a tiny network around the world of people that you can share every days with, other family offices like that?
I'd say that within London, I know almost everyone that does this role for family offices, partly because I put them in place when I left the various families. And we've kept in touch ever since, because when you're working on that sort of project and that class of assets, it's quite personal to the family. And even though I've ended up moving on from the Hinduja family who I worked for originally, I still very much keep in touch with the family members and want to find out how they're doing on a personal level, but also specific to the management of those assets. So whether they're thinking about refit, whether they're coming up to a 5 or 10 year survey, whether, you know, there's an aircraft that I think, you know, I might have another family member that I've come across that's looking for that specific type of aircraft, or, you know, there's so much of these things, as we all know, that happen inter-family and within families trusting other families. And so it's not a sector to make enemies in, you know. We all know each other, and and so to answer your question, Gus, very much we share a lot of information, inside information. I mean, specific to, I'll give you an example, the geopolitical situation at the moment, specific to this Suez Canal, is a big concern for super yachts, albeit a first world problem. Obviously on the much bigger scale, the issue of shipping through the Suez Canal and the threat with the Houthi rebels is a very real threat. But also this affects private ships that are moving in and out of that area. And we need to share information in live, real time. And that, at the moment, we can't do that unless we have input from other families that are moving their assets through the region. And so I get a lot of phone calls and have done historically when this was much more active, although I wouldn't say that it's particularly inactive, but there was certainly a very inflammatory period of time where they were specifically targeting commercial vessels and potentially super yachts. And so we needed hour by hour information as to whether the yachts would be under threat moving through that territory. And so we speak to each other and share information and discuss whether we're taking the decision to do that and the insurance risks, and not just that, but the risk to crew lives on board, and then whether the crew want to do that sort of passage in itself. Anyway, it's their choice, it's the captain's choice as to whether they want to take the vessel through or not. And so there's much, I think people probably see that we manage, or I manage, super yachts and aircraft and think, oh, wonderful, you must be sitting there enjoying holidays in the Bahamas. But this is, it's the same concerns that we're dealing with that commercial operators are dealing with, whether that's shipping or aircraft. So if there's disruption to aircraft movement because of Russia and the Ukraine, that affects us too in private aviation. And whether there's disruption to, war risk in the Suez Canal, that also affects us. And, we have to be, I think there's a much more sort of wider scope and remit than people would imagine when you first say, oh, we look after super yachts and aircraft and real estate for private individuals.
I mean, you've touched on some of the main concerns that I'm sure a lot of families have. Is there sort of an underpinning, like a central, I don't know what I'm trying to say, like a central, like a main, you've touched on like the concerns that family offices have. Is there like a main underpinning sort of...
What point are you making?
Like anxiety?
Anxiety. Like, I guess maybe that's probably the best way to put it. Shall I ask that again?
Anxiety specific to the operation of their assets.
That would like affect their decision making when purchasing assets.
Yeah, I mean, I think with that question, and people, as much as it's grouped together with aircraft and marine and real estate, these are three different functioning assets. So aircraft is still, albeit luxury, a means of transport from A to B. And there's multiple regulatory requirements which prevent you from implementing ridiculous things that you can do on super yachts, but can't necessarily do in the air because of risk to life. And it's the same with real estate. And so we have to treat those with three very different parameters and criteria management take. And so I guess to answer your question, the concerns about all three are very different. We can't have this conversation about these areas of management and operation without mentioning COVID and the impact of COVID, particularly on travel. And of course, what we saw in the marine sector was this enormous demand for new builds within marine, because suddenly people were unable to travel, they were unable to go somewhere with their families, where one territory was locking down, another one wasn't. And what's a good means of travel between those different territories? Well, super yacht is, where you can control your environment specific to how you wish to regulate, how you wish to test. You can have your own medical facility on board. And so that in itself was such an interesting movement in the time of COVID. And then of course with aircraft and aviation, we saw more people wanting to fly privately, but of course all of those restrictions to aircraft movement, and with that came a lot of logistics planning of how do we sort of not get around, but how do we kind of carefully manage those transport routes. And the demand again, shot up for aircraft and the use of aircraft. And we saw a profile of users that we hadn't necessarily seen before, where the US on an executive level, there was huge demand before that. And you see a lot of these kind of purchase of a number of hours of flying in these kind of club systems that we hadn't really had over here in Europe. And then a lot of companies setting up those kind of purchase per hour business models over here. And then with real estate, of course, the families moving between different countries dependent on, testing and where they felt safest, and, geography, I guess, relating to where the family kind of wanted to be, either together or separately, or where they felt, most supported medically. So I think COVID's a really interesting example of kind of I guess what I do really came into spotlight over that time, even though everyone was locked down, and we just saw this explosion of demand and time.
So with those three areas here, and lots of the conversations we have, most of the conversations we have with the family office are investment focused, they're return focused. Obviously, there is the other side to family office management, which is lifestyle and concierge, and clearly very complex side of those things. Are those three silos all passion and lifestyle focused with you guys, or is there any return element in what you do? Maybe more so in the real estate, I'm guessing, but...
Yeah, certainly there's much more crossover on the real estate side of things. And actually one of my first remits when I joined the family office was to look at investment opportunities within hospitality specifically. And those were in like tier gateway cities, kind of tier 1 gateway cities. I'm trying to articulate that. So sort of London, Paris, Berlin, Amsterdam. And actually one of the projects that we ended up doing with that family office that I did the grade 1 listed development project with was the old war office development in Whitehall. And so the family acquired that site from the government, and there was a bid process for that. And I think the family that I worked for at the time, they were very, they liked the real estate sector. I think they liked the kind of bricks and mortar investment profile. And also there's a sort of family profile, I think, element to it socially, where it was nice for them to have a kind of trophy asset that was based here in London. And of course we talk about trophy asset hunting a lot, and I wouldn't say the family are particularly interested in that, and owning one of the sort of the Berkeley, Connaught kind of Mayborn group type hotels. But at the same time a fantastic opportunity arose where we knew that we could create this wonderful hospitality space that was near to the family's residence, and has become a phenomenal success. So that was another, I guess, to answer your question, Gus, that certainly was a crossover of investment opportunity to sort of, but as we know with families, this has to also appeal to them from a personal perspective. How do they feel about the project? And with this family, I know they wanted specifically to have something that was close to home, that they could almost walk to and see the asset, in its tangible form. And this was a great opportunity for us to do that sort of crossover of, managing something on the development side that they loved, but that was also income generating and investment for capital growth.
And does art fall into that same kind of thing? Because that's, you've got a house and you've got the collection in there, the pleasure of looking at that collection, even whilst it's probably appreciating, is one of life's true pleasures. Is that fall in your remit as well, or is that a specialist outsourced thing? How do you guys deal with that?
Yeah, it does fall within my remit. I mean, it's been different depending on the family that I'm working for. I've worked for principals who don't want you to be anything to do with it, and they want to choose everything themselves. And I totally understand that approach. Right, it's so personal. And I also think that's, as you mentioned, I think you used the word pleasure there. It's a real pleasure choosing artwork for your residents, and to have someone else go and select that for you, I often find quite baffling, but then that's where the point of difference, I think, comes between the investment profile of art collection versus the kind of passion for art. And with this one particular principle that I'm thinking of, it's certainly, there was some crossover between pieces that he felt personal to him, particularly on the photography side of things, which I don't think will have enormous kind of investment and sort of growth value. But then he did also acquire very collectible pieces because he had an interest in developing artists and keeping abreast of what was happening in the art world. But certainly the biggest remit I've had in terms of art collection was for the first family I worked for, where we had this opportunity to do the grade 1 listed development, and we had miles of empty wall space, and the family, acquiring art should be a slow and considered process, but when your house is ready, you also want to acquire pieces, so that you're not living with empty walls for a decade. And so a lot of my job at the time, and we were a few years into the development, was, and I remember this very specifically, we had hired an art curator. I'm trying to think of the right word for this. A sort of art finder. They're called something different to that. It's a sort of, in the same way you would task someone with property finding, this an art consultant, I suppose, that you give a remit to, and then they go out and they source this artwork, and I remember us paying what I considered to be quite handsome sums for this art consultant to go out and look for art for the family. And every time they came back with a presentation, it was pretty disappointing. And it wasn't, just knew that it wasn't, they hadn't understood the family. And there's a lot of sort of specificity about the family themselves. Culturally, you needed to understand what shouldn't appear on the walls of, in this specific instance, an Indian family home, what was inauspicious to the family. So certain scenes were inauspicious, certain colours. You needed to have that sort of cultural understanding, but equally, they needed an understanding of what the family wanted themselves, and it was complex because we needed to be sensitive to the restoration of this beautiful building, which was 4 properties blended into one, and the history of it being the Prince Regent's Palace originally, historically, but also an acknowledgement that the family lived there, and there should have been a sort of sensitivity of this marriage of worlds, between English history and the Indian family.
Very
influence.
specific nuance to the exact mixture that would reflect the family and the property and everything.
That's right.
And basically a museum as well. You're filling a museum.
For sure.
No, it's not 2 or 3 pictures in a dining hall or something. It's enormous.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. And so part of my job then became to go to these auction houses, which was one of the best components of the job, and do the sort of bidding on behalf of the principals. And I remember in the end just saying to one of the principals, should we do this ourselves, because we're not having much success with the art consultants? And he eventually agreed with me, and then we were on a roll, then we could start acquiring
Amazing. In a previous life, I worked at Sotheby's, and was working in Impressionist and Modern there. So working with those collectors and kind of directing was mainly those who were hyper engaged and wanted to build collections and things, which was totally fascinating, very exciting to be in the auction rooms, and still go back quite a lot because it's a fun place to be.
Oh, I think
really
it's
is.
brilliant.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I've just been with an art consultant friend of mine who specialises in old masters, and we know that the last year's been quite difficult, I think, within the art market, and there hasn't been the sort of appetite that we've seen in the last few years preceding it. But she was saying the end of the year was really successful for them, and they had the best sort of old masters week they've had. And specific to US client base, which I think we're seeing a lot across luxury.
Was this post-election, or was there a driver
for
this?
Good question.
That's an interesting correlation, or if there is any correlation there. I'd love to dive into that. I cannot answer the question at all, but it'd be fascinating to look at that.
Yeah, I'd have to defer you to her for more inside information.
Well, the more and more we work with family offices, and as we said, we're coming from an alternative investment fund background, but there is a lot of direct investment. Debt is coming into it a lot more, and then as we move further and further into it, the passion investments and where they can cross the line from passion into return, which I think is the best combination. If you can enjoy it and it can make you money, that's just a very, very pleasant place to be. We're excited to be talking about that more. So it's really interesting to see that side of family offices, which we haven't really touched on that much.
No, definitely. I think we've touched on that tightrope between like the passion and the investment side of things in terms of within family office world or working within a family offices. For you, is there an investment team that works alongside you? What's the overlap there? Do you work together directly? Is it separate? Can you give us a bit more colour into that?
Yes, I can. And the answer is that it really varies depending on, I'm going to point out the obvious, but the size of the investment team and then what their remit is. You know, when I worked for the Russian family office, there was quite a lot of crossover because the principal's interests circled around real estate development specifically. So we'd often cross-reference projects that we were looking at and sort of price per square foot and build and, you know, contractor and availability and supply chains and things like that. And so there was definitely a sort of shared base of information there. And then I've mentioned already the development opportunity with the Old War Office, with our first family office that I work for. But then more recently, I'd say that actually the family quite likes to have the separation. And I think partly that is the conservation of privacy. So what we're managing, particularly when you become a family office the size of the Mittal Family Office, they want some separation and privacy of information. I think partly because there's a number of different family members that we're looking after. And also because I think that with some families there's a mentality that not everybody needs to know everything. And after 15 years, I sort of agree with that principle, actually. And I think that where there's a helpful transfer of information, of course, everybody's on board to help out, you know, the investment team if they need some information from us, and vice versa if we need some information from them. But equally, this is the family's off time that I look after. And so there's a responsibility, I think, of guarding that and not sharing too much information unless it's sort of to the benefit of the family in amongst the different teams.
So it's quite an arm's length type thing. It's connected, but you're not walking in lockstep the whole time. It's information where it's needed.
I'd say so, but I'll just revert to reiterating that it's so dependent on the family, and I'm talking with quite specifically about the family office that I work for, as opposed to the ones that I previously worked for, where there was much more of a kind of open dialogue. But I think with the growth of the family and the growth of the family office, it becomes a more sort of corporate aligned structure, in a way that when you first start a family office, and you know, I've been with family offices that are nascent and there's one person, and then you're joining and you're literally shaping and crafting a kind of platform for how you'll all work together. But once you've sort of got that locked down and everybody sort of knows their piece of the puzzle, there's certainly some share of information where needed, but it becomes a much more kind of corporate sort of similar looking structure the bigger the family office.
Do you have to, I mean, as soon as you put your hand up as a family office, or even if you're not putting your hand up, but I guess kind of known reputationally and obviously being one of the biggest in the world, you must get a lot of deal flow in your direction, or people trying to pitch stuff to you. Do you just put the shutters up there, or do you redirect it? Do you have to filter anything? Because that's obviously not what you want to be doing day to day, and probably a bit of a burden across you have to bear. How do you approach that? Do you just cold or redirect?
If I'm offered any more land in Rwanda, then
really, that's we've not heard
coming
that
out of
one.
my ears. You know, just so many. I mean, I'm talking here anecdotally about LinkedIn specifically, where people don't really read your job title and have almost zero understanding of family offices. And how could you? Because the domain remains quite private, and so people don't really understand how these things are carved out and who looks after what. But I think people see my job title and think the proximity to wealth means that they can pepper me with any investment opportunity there is, and that we might just on the off chance consider it. And certainly there are things that, you know, within the network of family offices, and I say this specific to AYU as well, there are people that I meet that I think it would be silly of me not to introduce them to the right person within the investment team, because the opportunity makes a lot of sense, and there's a lot of synergy between what I know the investment team are already working on and what their remit is. But those are the opportunities where there's a hyper filter in place there, where I know that it's come from a trusted body like yourself and a trusted social network. But it's endless, the number of sort of totally random kind of investment opportunities were offered.
Sorry, I just spoke over you. I was going to say, if you could guess, what would be the average amount, like a week or a month, of messages that you get on LinkedIn or emails from people pitching to you?
God, good question. I mean, I'd say 50 to 100 at times, like per 14 days. Maybe more than that. You know, to the extent that I've thought, I don't know why I'm on LinkedIn at all.
We see that with a lot of family offices, actually. Removing themselves.
But then I have had other instances, and I suppose this is a little bit like dating apps, where you've got to kiss a lot of frogs. But there are some princes out there, and I've met some really interesting other family offices on LinkedIn who've then become not only sort of people that we've ended up doing work with, but friends and kind of part of the social network that I've then introduced to networks like AYU. So it's just a case of, I think, like dating apps, I would say to people, just engage with it when you have the patience and time to do it.
Yes.
But yes, we are peppered.
They can be useful tools, but if the filtering is there, which is what we're hoping and trying to do for our family office and fund members, is to work on a small level and really be a gatekeeper to those 50, 100 messages, because that's a pain and it doesn't help anyone. Certainly doesn't help you, because you're, one, not going to have the time to go through those things, and two, it's a pain to have to pass them on. It's not your role. So what we're trying to do is make that easier for family offices behind that wall, and hopefully the trusted network is the key thing, basically. And most family offices, we know that a cold approach gets no response. You know, it's about trust. It's about a network there, basically. And it is unfortunate that so many people disabuse the term family office to get that conversation. I mean, fake family offices, one of our major topics right now. How prevalent do you see that in the rooms you're walking into? You know, people that, you know, I know I have flags go up in my mind. Okay, this doesn't smell right. Does that ring true?
But I would answer that question with a question, which is, how do you define a family office first of all, and then we can go from there about who's fake.
One of the hardest things to do.
Yes.
We've spent a lot of time doing it. And I guess kind of the starting point is the argument about AUM and where that kicks in. We've been back and forth over the years a lot, and some people would say it's 500 million and above, or 750, or even much larger than that. But there are plenty that can come down. You know, if you've just exited your company for $50 million and you want to set up your own investment portfolio, investment company, and you have a couple of advisors, then we think that qualifies as a family office. So we start there. We set that. I think we set that bar lower than everyone else, but we're very, very careful about the vetting process after that. And most people who come in and who become what we now have as the AYU approved family office, the AFO program, they come from a trusted source. There are references. We can actually point to the fact that they are telling the truth as much as possible, but then we also have the network effect after that, so we can reference our internal network, and importantly, those who could slip through the net, who are just, you know, kind of lying through their teeth, once they come in and go in and, you know, have their pitch opportunity, then our members say, look, these guys aren't who they are purporting to be. They're misrepresenting. Just doesn't fit, basically. So that's what we're trying to do, and the definition is the hardest bit. So long answer to your question, and it's a tough thing to solve, but that's where we're starting. Does that ring true? To, you know, because it is a big problem. It's a massive problem.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I also agree with you that the sort of analysis process for what makes up a family office has to be kind of multifaceted, and it has to be kind of case by case. Certainly, I've met personally a lot of individuals or representatives purporting to be family officers that I don't believe constitute a family office in the way that I would define it in my experience of seeing and working for family offices. I think it's difficult because, as with any other industry, if you have a good spokesperson, they can generate a lot of sort of supporters, and then those supporters can be very genuine, and they don't know. And then you're relying on the supporters for their verification that and you assume, well, they must have done their due diligence on this family office. And you and I both know of examples of that. And I've seen it numerous times. I think it's going to become more of an issue rather than less as we go on. And it's just something that I think that probably with experience, and I always say to people when they ring me, and this happened recently, and they said, listen, we met this guy through you, we just want to check that he's legit. And then immediately sort of alarm bells are ringing, and I'm thinking, God, like, how much can I vouch for this person? And I give the same answer every time, which is, I haven't worked in a family office with this specific person, and so I can't tell you whether they are 100% legit and can give you my own personal backing. And I'm sorry to say that you're still going to have to complete your own due diligence process and ask as many people as you can, because I'm sure there'll be different opinions. But unless I've worked with that person under the same roof, quite literally, in the family office, I'm just not going to vouch for someone.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't expect someone to do the same for me.
I think it makes sense. I think in this space there's a lot of privacy, as we know with the family offices. That's a big part of working with one. But because of that, it's allowed for a lot of people to kind of fall under this like cloak of, well, I'm being discreet. I'm not telling you because I'm respecting the family. But actually, that's allowed for a lot of bad players to essentially come in.
That's what we're trying to solve with this process. Is we don't want to be disclosing that private information, but we want to trust but verify the whole process. And if it's coming from a trusted source, that's the reference we'll take. Is exactly what you say. Is that okay? Well, what can we look at a network of people that can say that up to that point? And there are levels of trust, of vouching, and you can do it by kind of checking with private banks and institutions and what have you. We're not going near kind of SEC or FCA or full KYC and AML. Lots of acronyms there, but I think everyone knows what they mean. But we are doing as much as we can, and the whole reason for we've had this in plan for a long time. The whole reason for having it, only launching it now, and it's been kind of in the queue for a couple of years, is because we wanted to have a very strong base of membership who can act as references and build the strength there, basically. And I had it this afternoon with a family office coming to our summit in Miami in a couple of weeks' time, and I said, I apologise for asking all these quite strict questions, but we're vigilant about these things. And his response was, yeah, this is fantastic. It allows us to thrive within a trusted network, basically. So,
I'd also like to talk about the reverse issue to this, which is that with KYC protocol becoming so, I guess, commonplace, but also, enlarged. There's numerous different protocols that one has to, hoops to jump through now. From the perspective of someone that works within a family office, that's really problematic for us sometimes, where the principal does not want to give out all of that information, even though we all know that they're wholly legitimate. And I've encountered situations where we're almost not sort of passing KYC protocol, or let me rephrase that. It's not that we're not passing it, it's just that we're not willing to give the information required now, because once the information's out there, we can't manage where that goes next. Yeah. And so I think that there's an issue, of course, with this verification, but equally there's an issue with very legitimate people being sort of treated with suspicion and unable to either transact or even just connect with the right people because they're not willing to give out so much personal information.
Stepping back a bit from your talking about the specifics of some fairly complex interconnected geopolitical issues. What do you get involved in the rest of the non-investment side of the family office? So I'm talking things like a kind of specific concierge or lifestyle requests, philanthropy, event planning, that kind of thing. Is it you're wearing lots of hats, or are these 3 hats, those 4 hats we've talked about, that's you, and then there's someone else? Every family office, as we know, one family office, one family office, everyone's different. Is there a wide team of people internally, or would you outsource it?
I think if you went into a family office with a "that's not my job" mentality, you'd be out pretty quickly, because your job is really however the role grows organically and whatever the relationship is between you and the principals and the trust that's built up there and what they feel that they would like to entrust you and task you with doing. And so, for want of not using cliches, no 2 jobs are ever the same. It really depends on the principals that you're working with and where they either need help or where they want a different opinion. Because sometimes I've been asked for opinions on areas and sectors of the family office that really don't fall within marine, aircraft or real estate, but that because there's some preceding project that where you can draw a comparison of something somebody else within the family office is working on, they want a second opinion. And I do think that, as much as my point earlier that as the family office gets bigger, it becomes more of a corporate structure, you certainly need to try and acquire as much information as you can as an individual to give you some of that kind of background knowledge, and that does take time. There's a reason why if you're good and trusted, you stay with the family for a long time, because it takes years to gain all of the sort of nuances of what individual family members might like or what they would choose and their differences, and where there might be a point of contention with how they want to use those assets. And a lot of the assets that I look after, of course, with aviation and marine are shared use assets. So I think there's a large component of my job, and I often say this to people, is sort of 60% politics and 40% doing the actual work. And I don't mean that to belittle the role of the politics at all. I think that there's an intelligence required there that you can't interview for necessarily. You can only know that because another family office has hired that person, and hence why we see so much transfer normally between family offices, and people want a person that has worked for a family office before. They don't want to take someone that has no experience of that. Because if you come from the corporate world into a family office, it's quite a shock about how things work and who makes the decisions on what and how. So I hope that answers that question.
Definitely. Yeah, I've heard that about it being quite a culture shock in terms of just a very, very different way of doing business, which can be rewarding and come with challenges as well, I'm sure. What is the most interesting request that you've had from a family you've worked with? I don't have to say any names, but...
Most interesting request I've had. You know what? I'm going to answer that in a slightly roundabout way by saying that the families that I've worked for, I haven't found anything that they've sort of asked me to do particularly surprising or kind of out of the ordinary. And I think that I'm going to do a sort of psychological assessment here. I think that I've worked for a lot of second to third generation family offices, and when you've held that sort of level of wealth and it's multi-generational, there's a sort of protocol and contentment that comes with having that level of wealth. It's the new inquiries from other individuals or families that are chartering the assets that are particularly unusual.
Okay, that's interesting. I could see that. I could see that.
I don't dig in anymore.
No, I get that. I think, yes, so my last question for you would be, what is the most fun thing about your job?
Because lots of people will look at your job and go, wow, that's cool. Obviously, we've uncovered so much about it, but what do you love?
It's a very cool job, and it's cool because of just the variety and challenge of often having to manage situations that are occurring in a kind of short and immediate timeline. I could give you so many examples of that where we've had to respond quickly and dynamically to sort of urgent situations, whatever those might be, and you're having to think on your feet, and you are the ultimate decision maker, and you don't get that opportunity in a lot of jobs. You've got to work your way up and do your time until you're at the top of the ladder, and then you might be allowed to make a decision. And, you know, as much as I've done the time, I feel, with family offices, I still feel like there's challenges that present themselves that I've not seen before. And it goes back to that sort of intelligence that I was talking about with interviewing people for family offices, where they either have that sort of, I suppose you could call it like emotional intelligence, or they don't. And I'm constantly presented with interesting situations where we have to be nimble and dynamic, and sensitive to the family and representing them. You're an ambassador for the family wherever you are. And you need to be aware and diplomatic and sensitive to that position. So it's a huge position of trust, and I think that's probably one of the most interesting and exciting and rewarding parts of the role for sure.
Flick, I think we're going to have to get you back for a second and third episode here, because there's so many unanswered questions. You've given us really, really fantastic insight into what you do, and I think also an area of family offices which is often not covered because there's so much investment first kind of stuff, and the depths of your job are frankly quite terrifying, and will terrify a lot of PMs out there. The level of stuff you're dealing with. So, yeah, if you'll come back, we'd love to have you again, and thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you both. It's been an absolute pleasure, and yeah, I would love to come back whenever you need me.
Thank you.
Whenever
we'll see you in Miami.
Wow, Felicia, she is fascinating. I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to her about a lot of stuff that we don't necessarily, as we mentioned in the beginning, talk about.
No. I'd like to know a lot more about that, because obviously the lifestyle side is one thing, but the operational side, that's, you know, they're big investments, but they're not necessarily returning focused investments, which is what we talk about most of the time, and the organisation that goes into it, and it sounds like a pretty stressful job.
It does. The thing that I actually found interesting as well was that a lot of these family offices, you think of them being quite potentially maybe like flashy or spending a lot of their money, but actually what I kind of gathered from that was a lot of these families, a lot of the older money, second gen, third generations, they don't seem to necessarily be throwing cash as frivolous as we think. The
point about content was, I noticed,
yes.
Like, you know, if it's not, you know, not rushing to buy, you know, those passion assets or the flashy assets. No, I don't like the word flashy there. They're not rushing to buy passion assets or, you know, those big ticket items. It's a little quieter luxury.
Quiet luxury.
And that's, you know, that's another level of,
what is it? Wealth whispers, money talks.
There we go. So yeah, really fascinating. We're definitely going to have to get Flick back on the podcast. I've got loads more questions.
Yeah, so do I. And I also want to ask her where she can get me a super yacht.
And the AYU jet. Yeah,
and the AYU jet. Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Luce. Thank you to
guys.
Flick for today. Thanks, Ash. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Ella. Been a really good second episode.
Bye.
Miami Hedge Fund Week and Miami Alts Week is coming. January 27th to the 30th. Join us at the Family Office Summit on January 27th in South Beach, and the AYU Yacht January 28th and 29th in Miami Beach. Bespoke, members-only events in private settings with strictly limited guest lists. Curated investment introductions, connections with private family offices, alternative funds and founders. Apply to join at thisisayu.com.